Hello. So we are officially moved on to more of the things that you probably thought we were going to learn about in biology. And so one of those things is the cell. And so we are going to spend quite a bit of time on the cell. So I don't want to take this information too fast. Everything that we've talked about so far is all of the necessary key players that are necessary for like nutrients and survival. But now we are getting into actually using that and where that is used at. So this video is the introduction to cells part 1. Like last chapter, I broke this first section up into 2 parts because there is a lot of information that I really want to address in more detail, so I'm not trying to move too fast. After this video, you should be able to state the cell theory and list the discoveries that led to it. You should be able to also be able to describe the diversity of cell shapes and explain why cells are so small. So pretty key things there. Okay, so let's start off with the discovery of the cells. I do believe that historical achievements in science are really important things. So it's a very good chance that you'll see timelines of these discoveries and how they shaped the theory that we know as the cell theory today. So the very first thing we should talk about is the fact that the cell was established. So the first time the word was ever used was referred to tiny units of life. And that was done by a British scientist named Robert Hooke. And so Robert Hooke, what he did was he actually used a microscope to study living things. And I know using a microscope today is not a huge thing, but back in that day, microscopes were not very strong. So to make these huge discoveries, such as looking at living things under a microscope, was a pretty big achievement. And so what he looked at was he looked at these small slices of cork under a microscope, and he saw these tiny little shapes that look like honeycombs. And if you don't know what a honeycomb is, I can draw it in class, but they look like this tiny shape. And so he made this drawing to illustrate this. And then he kind of like not contemplated, but he kind of inferred that they're like tiny units and they're repeating units. So he ended up calling these things cells. And if you think of a cell, the name cell, it means like a little holding block, if you will. And so I know this is probably not a good way to relate this, but like prison cells, it's a small area that contains a number of things and more importantly, prisoners. So we're not talking about those types of cells, but I'm just trying to get you to think of the idea. So that was Robert Hooke, first person to establish the idea of a cell. So I guess in our timeline, that would be the first thing we would talk about is the use of the microscope, very weak microscopes, to observe living organisms, and he named them cells. So later, a new guy comes in. His name is Anton van Leeuwenhoek, and he made his own microscope. So he decided that microscopes were just not powerful enough to do what he wanted to do. And so he comes in and he's like, well, I'm going to make my own. And he made it so strong that it's almost as strong as the light microscopes that we actually have today. So that's pretty impressive since this was in like the 1800 time frame. So anyways, using his very powerful microscope of the time, he discovered tiny animals that had like small little projections. One of those animals was called a rotifer, and they live in our water all the time. You actually probably drink some. They're not bad. They're very tiny organisms. So like I said, he observed very tiny animals, and he also discovered human blood cells. So pretty big achievement. Maybe didn't know the exact role or function of those blood cells, but he realized that there are cells that make up humans. He even went so far as to scrape off plaque off his teeth, which if he didn't do that, we never would know about a small little animal known as bacteria. So thanks to Leeuwenhoek, I don't even think I'm saying that right. I just think I sound good. But anyway, thanks to him, we have discovered bacteria and human blood cells, and go on further in science, and you'll realize that these are very important things in our lives. All right, so I guess this is the stuff you probably want to know about the cell theory. And so you should already know, because we learned this like in the very first chapter, that all living things somehow involve the cell in some way. Whether you're unicellular or multicellular, there is a cell that keeps all living things alive. Okay, so keep that in the back of your mind. Now, by the early 1800s, there were many observations about cells that were made, but there were 2 German scientists that really stuck out. Theodor Schwann and Matthias Jacob Schlinden proposed that cells are the basic building blocks of living things. So I'd like you to highlight that phrase, and if you don't do it now, you'll do it in class, I'm sure. But cells are the basic building blocks of all living things. Super important. That is what classifies. It's one of the main characteristics that classifies all living organisms as living, is the fact that they have cells. So it's a common characteristic among all living things. So in 1850, so again, we're moving on to our timeline. So remember, we've talked about Robert Hooke, I can't even say his name right now. And then now we're talking about Theodor Schwann and Matthias Jacob Schlinden, and they proposed that cells are the basic building blocks of life. Now we have a new guy. His name is Rudolf Virchow, and he observed cells under a microscope, and what he saw was something super crazy that people at the time were really hesitant on thinking about. He saw that all of these cells, these living cells, were dividing, and they were continuously dividing. So he kind of proposed this idea that new cells are developed from living cells, and they divide continuously. So cells have so much time, and then they divide to create new cells that do that same job or that same function. So the cell theory was then proposed. And so these three scientists kind of led to that main idea of the cell theory, along with the other two in the previous slide. So all organisms are made of one or more cells, so either unicellular or multicellular. All the life functions of organisms occur within the cell. So everything that keeps animals and organisms alive is done within a cell, or within a number of cells, I should say. All cells come from already existing cells, meaning that previously existing cells have to divide to create new cells. So 3 things I would like you to start embedding this into your memory, because we will apply these concepts to different scenarios, and you'll tell me if it backs up the cell theory or not. So diversity of cells. So you should hopefully have a little bit of background knowledge about cells. You should know that not all cells are the same. Okay, they have many things in common. So they can share functions like they use energy, they respond to the environment, they reproduce, different things like that. But different types of cells, even within your same body, have different unique functions. So we have nerve cells in our body, and we have epithelial cells in our body, and we have digestive cells in our body. So we have all different types of cells within our body, and so all of these cells have different functions, and those functions may even lead into different sizes, or different shapes of the cell, just depending on their particular job. So if they are a specific type of cell, they have a specific type of job, they may have a different look than those that have another type of job. And then cell size. So cells have many different sizes, but all are incredibly small. So some cells may be a little bit larger than others, but they're still super tiny. In a period at the end of a sentence, there's thousands and millions of cells within that little period. So that's how small we're talking. We're not talking about anything very big. Okay, so quick reminder, remember that the point of cells is to keep living organisms alive. All cellular function, all bodily function, I shouldn't say bodily function, but all chemical reactions occur within the cell. Everything occurs within the cell. So you have a whole bunch of cells together, they're doing their job. That's what actually gets us going. So how can something so small determine our life? And so I'm going to explain to you why cell sizes need to be the size that they are. So in order for cells to carry out life processes, a cell must be able to pass substances in and out of cells. So these substances include nutrients, like the macromolecules we just talked about, oxygen into and out of the cell, and any other important elements or compounds or anything like that that our body needs to function. Another important thing is that the cell also needs to push out waste. So it wants to pass nutrients in, but it also wants to get rid of waste. So everything has a waste component. So in order to come in order to come in and out of a cell, you have to cross its outer surface, also known as that phospholipid bilayer, and we'll talk about that in more detail. So nutrients and waste need to pass through. So the cell passes substances across, and that's what limits how large a cell can be. So I want you to think of two cubes, okay? A very small cube and a very large cube. The very large cube has less surface area relative to its volume than a smaller cube. And so what I mean by that is the ratio between surface area and volume is a lot smaller for larger objects than the ratio of a smaller object. So, for example, if I have a small cube with a surface area of 6 centimeters squared and a volume of 1 centimeter cubed compared to a large cube, and I can draw this because I'm thinking maybe you guys are like, what? Compared to a large cube that has a surface area of 54 centimeters cubed and a volume of 27 centimeters cubed. I got the units wrong. Either way, what I'm saying is that the ratios between surface area and volume are completely different. Larger items have larger volume, and so they need more, okay? Their surface area is not as big compared to their volume, and then they also require more. So let's say a big cell and a small cell, you need more nutrients and oxygen, and they produce more waste. So that's an issue with our body, right? If cells don't have enough surface area, then they can't fully do their job. So a cell with a larger volume, it needs, like I just mentioned, it needs more nutrients, it needs oxygen, and it produces more waste. So because all of these substances have to pass through the surface of the cell, a cell with a large volume will not have enough surface area to allow to meet its needs. So the volume and surface area ratio does not work in order to pump out and pump in the nutrients and the waste. So the larger the cell is, the smaller its ratio of surface area to volume, and the harder it'll be for the cell to get rid of waste and to take in substances. So that is why our cells are limited to the size they are. They cannot grow bigger because they wouldn't be able to undergo life's processes. And so I will explain this in better detail because I feel like I kind of confused this concept. The next thing I want to talk about and just very quickly mention is that different functions of cells often mean different shapes. So a nerve cell has a completely different shape than a cell found in your skin. And the reason for that is because the function of a nerve cell is to transmit signals. Okay, so it tells you, hey, you're burning your hand on the stove, move your hand. It's transmitting signals. So the nerve cell has to be super long so that it makes those connections with your muscles and with your brain. So very specialized function there. So their shape is evolved to perform that function. All right, so I realize that maybe some of these concepts are confusing. I will talk about these in more detail later. Please ask me any questions on Edpuzzle.